The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly over the Sahel, casting long shadows across the dusty landscape of Burkina Faso. President Ibrahim Traoré's motorcade arrived punctually at the steel gates of Kaya military base, the engines humming with precision despite the oppressive heat. Security arrangements appeared flawless. The outer walls were fortified, entrance points sealed, and every soldier within the base had been thoroughly vetted. Everything seemed to be in perfect order. Yet, the security team had overlooked one critical detail. The danger wasn't lurking outside the walls, but festering within them. Hidden behind familiar uniforms and loyal salutes, wearing the same flag on their chests but harboring treachery in their hearts, the real threat waited patiently for the perfect moment to strike. As President Traoré stepped out of his armored vehicle, the scorching heat hit him like a physical blow. The metal surfaces around the base shimmered with heat waves, and the air carried a peculiar mixture of sweat, gunpowder, and something else. Something that felt ominously like conspiracy. General Tapsoba, standing rigidly at attention with his unit, called out in a booming voice, "Mr. President, welcome to Kaya Base." His words echoed across the courtyard. But there was something unsettling about the way his eyes gleamed, a strange intensity that President Traoré's sharp instincts immediately detected. "The soldiers look exceptionally disciplined today, General," President Traoré remarked with his characteristic measured tone, adjusting his red beret with a practiced motion while maintaining his diplomatic smile. "Sir, they have been eagerly awaiting your arrival," General Tapsoba replied with apparent respect. But the unusual gleam in his eyes betrayed something deeper, something that couldn't escape the president's keen observation. Mamadou, the president's security chief and trusted barber-turned-bodyguard, quietly approached. Sweat beaded on his forehead, though not entirely from the brutal heat. His weathered hands, accustomed to handling razors with precision, now rested instinctively near his sidearm. Something extraordinary had put him on high alert. "Sir," Mamadou whispered urgently, "something feels wrong. These soldiers are unusually tense and restless. There's no laughter, no casual chatter, nothing that you'd typically expect from a military base." President Traoré surveyed his surroundings with the tactical awareness of a former soldier. The atmosphere indeed felt artificial, like a poorly constructed movie set. The unnatural silence and forced composure seemed orchestrated. "Perhaps they've prepared some special demonstration for my visit," the president mused aloud, though unease stirred in his chest like a warning bell. Mamadou leaned closer, his voice barely audible above the desert wind. "Sir, this place is too quiet." A normal military base always has some level of activity: shouted orders, equipment maintenance, weapons cleaning, general bustling. Here, everything feels predetermined, rehearsed. General Tapsoba led them toward the weapons depot, his boots clicking against the concrete with mechanical precision. "These are the latest Russian weapons, Mr. President. They arrived from Moscow just last month, highly effective against terrorist threats." As President Traoré entered the depot, the atmosphere immediately became heavier, more oppressive. Instead of the cool relief he expected from the shade, an eerie silence seemed to drip from the walls like condensation. His trained eyes quickly noticed over 20 soldiers positioned in the rear corners of the depot, far more personnel than any standard security protocol would require. Their gazes were fixed on him with an intensity that felt more predatory than protective. "General, why are so many soldiers stationed here?" President Traoré inquired, his voice carrying the authority of a leader accustomed to direct answers. "Additional security measures, sir, for your safety," Tapsoba replied without hesitation, but his answer felt rehearsed, too smooth. Mamadou's face now clearly reflected his growing alarm. His hand unconsciously moved toward his weapon as his eyes rapidly surveyed the entire depot, cataloging potential threats and escape routes with the instincts of a man who had spent years protecting others. "Sir, we need to leave immediately. Nothing about this situation is normal," he urged, his voice tight with suppressed tension. At that precise moment, a thunderous crash echoed through the depot. Clang! The massive steel door slammed shut with the finality of a coffin lid, as if fate itself had decided to seal their doom. President Traoré spun around in surprise. "What's happening?" he demanded. But his question was answered by the sight of masked soldiers emerging from behind walls and equipment, like deadly shadows materializing from a nightmare. The depot door's closure sent a wave of dread through the enclosed space. The metallic clang didn't just reverberate off the walls. It seemed to penetrate directly into President Traoré's heart. For a split second, everyone froze as if time itself had paused to witness the unfolding treachery. President Traoré's gaze locked onto Mamadou, whose eyes now reflected both fear and fierce determination. This loyal man, who had transformed himself from a simple barber into the president's most trusted protector, recognized the trap they had walked into. "Mr. President, this isn't standard security protocol. This is an ambush," Mamadou declared, with grave seriousness, immediately assuming a defensive position. His hands moved instinctively toward his pistol, not from aggression, but from the protective instincts of a guardian facing mortal danger. Suddenly, approximately 20 masked soldiers emerged from concealed positions throughout the depot. Their faces were covered, their weapons trained directly on the president. In seconds, the weapons storage facility had transformed from a showcase of military hardware into a death chamber designed for execution. "Hands up!" one of the masked figures shouted, his voice distorted by his covering but unmistakably commanding. Without hesitation, Mamadou drew his weapon and positioned himself between the president and the immediate threats. "Stay back! I'm protecting the president!" His words rang through the air like a battle cry. But bullets travel faster than words or noble intentions. Bang! 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 3 shots struck Mamadou in the chest and abdomen. Blood sprayed in crimson arcs that reached the depot walls, painting them with the evidence of ultimate sacrifice. As he stumbled and fell, his eyes remained fixed on President Traoré with unwavering loyalty. "Sir, this is a trap. Trust no one," he managed to whisper through trembling lips before his voice fell silent forever, joining the ranks of those who die defending what they believe in. President Traoré's heart shattered as he watched his faithful protector fall. He lunged toward Mamadou's still form, but hostile forces surrounded him on all sides. Enemies wearing familiar uniforms, displaying the same flag on their chests, yet with hearts corrupted by betrayal and foreign gold. "Now it's your turn, Mr. President," one of the attackers declared, raising his weapon toward Traoré. But the president's attention had shifted to General Tapsoba, who stood calmly in a corner, observing the carnage with disturbing composure. There was no surprise on his face, no reaction to the violence, as if he had orchestrated every moment of this deadly theater. "You knew all of this beforehand." President Traoré's voice was quiet but cutting, filled with the pain of recognition. A cold light flickered in the general's eyes as he smiled, not with friendship, but with the cruel satisfaction of a predator, revealing its true nature. "Yes, I knew. In fact, I planned all of this," Tapsoba confessed without shame, his words carrying the weight of ultimate treachery. President Traoré's eyes blazed with a mixture of disbelief and fury. "Why? Why did you do this?" "Because you were taking the country in the wrong direction," Tapsoba replied with chilling calmness. "Your alliances with Russia, China, Iran, Palestine. You stabbed the West in the back. Israel showed me the truth about what needed to be done." The revelation hit President Traoré like a physical blow. This wasn't just betrayal. It was part of an international conspiracy, a web of foreign manipulation that had been woven within his own nation's borders. The president's eyes now contained more than just pain and shock. There was a fierce spark, the inner fire of a soldier whose sense of justice had been ignited by the poison of deception. Standing before him was General Tapsoba, A man who had sworn oaths of loyalty for years, now revealed as an enemy who had grown from within like a cancer. "You're working for Israel," President Traoré stated, his voice carrying the weight of horrified confirmation. Tapsoba nodded with prideful arrogance rather than shame. "I'm working for Burkina Faso's security, Mr. President. The direction you were heading would have led us to destruction. Your alliance with Iran, your soft stance toward Hamas, your open support for Palestine, all of this had become a threat to regional stability." President Traoré's voice rose with righteous anger. "So you decided to kill me? You turned our own soldiers against their commander?" Tapsoba's tone remained coldly calculated. "I did what was necessary. Israel explained that if you weren't stopped, we would all face international isolation. America, France, Europe, they would all turn against us. What I did as a commander thinking of the greater good." "No." Traoré's voice shook with emotion. "What you did was the act of a coward, a puppet whose strings are pulled by foreign masters." Anger flashed in Tapsoba's eyes at being called a puppet. "Puppet? I saved my rank, my honor. You were the one pushing the country toward war with your emotional politics. You were dragging us into Middle Eastern conflicts through your reckless policies. Israel simply showed me the path. I took the steps myself. This was no longer a debate about principles or logic. It had become a collision between two worldviews, one of self-determination and sovereignty, the other of submission disguised as pragmatism. At that moment, one of the masked soldiers approached the president, pressing his gun against Traoré's temple. "Get on your knees," he commanded with brutal authority. "This is what happens to those who become enemies of Israel," the soldier declared, his words carrying the weight of a death sentence. The president's ears rang as if explosions were going off inside his head. Mamadou's body still lay nearby, his blood growing cold on the concrete floor. But the lava of rage boiled within President Traoré's chest. "I wasn't born to bow," the president said quietly but firmly. "Killing me is easy, but my vision will never die." The soldier adjusted his weapon's aim, and the smell of death filled the air. But at that precise moment, boom! A massive explosion tore through the depot wall. Dust, smoke, and debris created a chaotic fog through which several shadowy figures entered like avenging angels materializing through the haze. The soldiers panicked, and General Tapsoba retreated in confusion. These were the loyal troops, those who would stand with their president until their last breath. A young soldier's thunderous voice cut through the chaos. "Where is the president? Traitors, drop your weapons!" The depot became a battlefield. Gunfire, screams, and smoke filled the space simultaneously. Amid the crackling bullets and chaos, President Traoré lay wounded on the ground, bloodied but alive. The echo of gunfire now raised new questions. Who will survive? Who will be held accountable? And who will be remembered by history as the traitor? After the wall breach, time seemed suspended. In the storm of dust and smoke, only one thing could be clearly heard: the relentless, merciless rain of bullets. Either loyal soldiers who had arrived at the last moment to protect President Ibrahim Traoré were now risking everything. The president, who moments before had been surrounded only by traitorous soldiers, had taken cover in a corner amid the intense firefight. A bullet had grazed his arm, but he refused to retreat. His eyes remained fixed on Mamadou's body, his heart filled with a single vow. "No more Mamadous will die." General Tapsoba shouted commands to his traitorous troops. "Finish them all! Let no one survive! This is our last chance!" On the other side, the loyal forces were led by Lieutenant Issa Bando, a young but fiercely devoted commander who truly believed in President Traoré's populist leadership and revolutionary vision. "Get the president out. We must extract him. Alive at all costs," Bando called to his men. 3 soldiers immediately took defensive positions and began moving toward the president. but the traitors opened heavy fire on them. One young man was killed instantly, another lost his arm, and the third crawled along the ground to reach the president. "Mr. President, we need to evacuate," the wounded soldier gasped. President Traoré used his shirt to try to stop the bleeding and stood up with the soldier's support. His gaze fell on General Tapsoba, who was retreating with a venomous smile, as if he knew he still held the upper hand. "I'm still alive, Tapsoba!" the president's voice rang out. "However many traitors like you may come, the spirit of this nation can neither be broken nor destroyed." At that moment, Bando threw a grenade toward the traitor's position. The explosion caused chaos in their ranks. Some fell to the ground, others screamed, and some fled entirely. In the confusion, an attempt was made to evacuate the president. But suddenly, Tapsoba himself emerged from the rear door of the depot carrying an automatic rifle. His eyes now held a crazed look, as if this were his final battle. "You won't leave here alive, Traoré," he roared. But Bando stepped in front of him. "If you want to reach the president, you'll have to go through me first." Tapsoba opened fire. Bando returned fire. Both men wounded each other and fell to the ground. President Traoré rushed to Bando's side and took his hands. "You saved my life." Blood was on Bando's lips, but so was a smile. "The greatest pride of my life is that I fought for you." Tears filled the president's eyes. He knew this wasn't just one soldier's sacrifice. It was the price of a nation's awakening. The sound of gunfire gradually subsided. The loyal soldiers had secured control of the depot, but the bodies scattered on the ground prevented any celebration. Each corpse raised a question. Are we truly free? President Traoré took one final look at Mamadou, Bando, and the other fallen heroes, then said quietly, "Our sun of freedom has been colored with blood, but this sun will never set." President Traoré was transported to a nearby military hospital in critical condition, but his mind found no peace, not even for a moment. The loyal soldiers who had rescued him from the depot knew this wasn't just a single incident, but part of a vast international network that had been woven around them for years. The roots of betrayal ran deep, and the list of enemies included more than just General Tapsoba and his handful of soldiers. The real conspiracy was being orchestrated from elsewhere entirely. During this time, among the debris and blood-stained walls of the depot, a wounded soldier discovered a steel box with Hebrew markings. When this box was opened with a mixture of curiosity, fear, and suspicion, the treasure inside proved to be a bundle of classified documents that would shock the world. The documents clearly revealed Israeli intelligence Mossad's stamped conspiracy and Operation Cobra Finger plan to overthrow Burkina Faso's government instructions for running propaganda campaigns against President Traoré through African media and social networks authorization to provide secret funds and overseas properties to high-ranking military officers, international plans to eliminate African leaders who showed sympathy for Gaza. When these files reached the general staff, several high-ranking officers turned pale. Some immediately resigned and declared themselves absent, while others attempted to book international flights to escape justice. The count of traitors within Burkina Faso's military was now being openly revealed. Despite his severe injuries, President Traoré announced an emergency press conference the following evening. With his wounded arm in a bandage and his body bearing the marks of battle, his face still carried the same determination and fire. "My fellow citizens of Burkina Faso," he began, "my young people, my farmers, my students, my elders, today I cannot hide the truth from you. Today you must learn what demons have plotted to break us apart." He held up the files they had discovered, raising them high in the air like evidence in a court of justice. "These are the schemes of our enemies. These are the documents of those who want to keep Africa perpetually enslaved. Those who want to deprive us of our water, gold, cobalt, and freedom. These are the same hands that murder children in Palestine and purchase our brothers among us here. During the press conference, he displayed all the pages bearing Israeli intelligence seals. He read aloud the names of all officers who had taken bribes from America, France, or Israel to leak internal information. He then demanded that the International Criminal Court and African Union begin immediate investigations. Fayao. Revelation sent shockwaves around the world. Al Jazeera ran the headline, Burkina Faso President Exposes Israeli Coup Operation. BBC wrote, Traoré survives coup, leaks explosive intel on Mossad backing. Al Mayadeen, Press TV, and South African News declared this event a new turning point for African freedom. Meanwhile, Israel immediately dismissed these accusations as propaganda, but the documents began circulating within the international intelligence community. Then a former French military agent anonymously told the media, "All of this is true. I was myself an advisor on this operation." Another bombshell. President Traoré concluded with these final words, "I may be wounded, but I am not broken. The day we bow down is the day we die. As long as I draw breath, I will keep Burkina Faso free, non-aligned, and proud, even if it costs me my life." After President Ibrahim Traoré's press conference, not only did turmoil erupt in Burkina Faso, but a wave of anger and outcry swept across all of Africa. Yet surprisingly, even when the president presented irrefutable evidence of Israeli and French involvement, the United Nations remained silent. No condemnatory statement, no emergency session. It seemed as if the international organization was deliberately turning a blind eye. President Traoré once again questioned the UN in his speech to the nation. If the world's largest peace organization remains silent even after an international conspiracy and attack on a country's president, then is this organization a representative of peace or a mouthpiece for imperial powers? The public shared this speech millions of times on social media. Hashtags like Our Africa Speaks and Truth About Africa began trending. During this period, demonstrations in support of President Traoré began in other African countries. In Ghana, university students raised banners, "Today Burkina Faso, tomorrow us" in Nigeria, imams and church pastors issued a joint declaration, "We stand with African awakening." In South Africa's parliament, a member demanded the UN investigate the attack on Traoré within Burkina Faso. The atmosphere was also changing. Cities, where people previously didn't venture out due to fear, now saw popular rallies. People embraced each other saying, "We are all Mamadou, we are all Bando, we are all Traoré." The government also opened a new front. All military officers and soldiers were subjected to rescreening. Investigation began into all NGOs receiving foreign funding. Most importantly, Burkina Faso suspended the UN mission. President Traoré made this announcement personally. "Until the United Nations respects our sovereignty, our lives, and our blood, it cannot set foot in our country." This announcement caused silence in the UN General Assembly in New York. Some international analysts called President Traoré's bold statement suicidal, but the African people called it freedom's trumpet call. That same evening, representatives from Tanzania, Mali, Guinea, and Chad officially announced that if the UN didn't investigate the attack on Traoré, they too might impose restrictions on UN missions. Africa was awakening. If there was one face that had amazed everyone after the Kaya base attack, it was Mamadou's. The same Mamadou who once worked as a barber, wore simple clothes, and was recognized in every street and alley. When he appeared at a public press conference the day after the attack, standing beside President Traoré, all of Burkina Faso seemed to resonate with applause. President Traoré said on this occasion, "This man is neither a soldier nor a trained agent, but his patriotism, honor, and sacrifice saved our lives. Today I declare Mamadou a soldier and guardian of Burkina Faso." Tears were in Mamadou's eyes, but they contained no weakness. He took the microphone and said, I only did what every poor, oppressed but conscious African should do. When my land, my mother, and my president were in danger, how could I remain silent? After this speech, Mamadou's name became a slogan throughout the country. In markets, squares, mosques, churches, schools, and even on the walls of rural villages, slogans were written, "We are all Mamadou, not barbers, but liberators. This nation has awakened." That same day, President Traoré issued a new presidential decree. The Mamadou National Movement was established, incorporating volunteers from every village, district, and city. The purpose was to secure the country not just with guns, but with conscious people. Mamadou was made the head of this movement. The first thing Mamadou did was go personally to every village and alley. He addressed people of all backgrounds: youth, farmers, women, teachers, imams, pastors, even former criminals. His message was simple but touching. As long as we consider ourselves small, we will remain slaves. The day we recognize the honor within ourselves, we will change our destiny. This message electrified people's hearts. Young people began making revolutionary videos on social media. Elders started telling old stories of honor, honesty, and rebellion. Mamadou was no longer just a face. He had become a vision. On the other side, opposing forces were alarmed by this change. French intelligence agencies reported that this new popular spirit wouldn't remain confined to one country. If people like Mamadou emerged in other African countries too, the end of imperial control would be certain. Indeed, this change wasn't stopping at Burkina Faso's borders. In Niger, students displayed Mamadou's speeches on central screens and silently included his name in national anthems. In Guinea, labor organizations said, "We too want to become Mamadou's army." In Senegal, church leaders said, "Mamadou's truth has shaken us too." In his final rally, Mamadou said a historic line, "We weren't invited to the table, so now we'll build our own table. We'll make our own bread and write history with our self-respect." After this, the Mamadou National Movement launched a One Village, One Trained Youth plan. Now a new Mamadou was being prepared in every village through character, courage, and sacrifice. President Traoré said, "For our protection, we don't just need soldiers now, but characters like Mamadou who can neither be bought nor bent." Mamadou's father, who once sold vegetables in the market, said, "I never thought my son would challenge the world's empires, but this was no longer just about one son. This was the awakening of an entire nation, and this awakening wasn't limited to mere words. It was a fire that was about to spread from eastern Burkina Faso to western Africa." Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C.'s powerful circles, there was chaos after the conspiracy documents from President Traoré's side came to light. A secret meeting was called inside the Pentagon, where CIA, NSA, and African affairs experts were present. "How is it possible that all those documents leaked out?" a senior CIA officer asked through gritted teeth. "We kept Operation Cobra Finger completely compartmentalized. Only 5 people had complete access, but General Fredson in the room pounded the table. But one Mamadou destroyed everything. A barber, a common man, turned years of our work to dust." At the same time, an official report emerged analyzing public opinion in Burkina Faso. The report stated that President Traoré's popularity had reached 85%, and he was emerging not just as a leader of Burkina Faso, but as a revolutionary leader of African consciousness. These words were a nightmare for America. French and American influence in African countries had already weakened, and now, if other countries followed Burkina Faso's example, the collapse of the imperial structure was certain. A senior Pentagon analyst said, "If we don't stop Traoré, within a few months, Guinea, Mali, Chad, Niger, even Angola will experience a new political wave, and we won't get any African territory to land on." On the other side, a high-level security meeting was also taking place in Tel Aviv, Israel. The head of Mossad said in a very serious tone, This is the first time an African leader has made direct accusations against us with evidence. This isn't just an individual's grudge, but a declaration that, if we don't stop it, could end our interests in the Middle East and Africa. The Israeli government immediately issued a press release. The accusations of Burkina Faso's president are false and baseless. Israel never interferes in any country's internal affairs. But the reality was far different from this statement. The Israeli ambassador in Washington met secretly with American officials and said, "We need your help. If this person, Traoré, becomes more powerful, your grip will also weaken. It's time we adopt joint soft measures." This meant spreading fake news on social media, presenting Traoré as a dictator in African media, fueling inflation, shortages, and rebellion in the country, and most importantly, planning another internal attack. But all this wasn't as easy as before, because Traoré had ordered surveillance on all military transfers. In Burkina Faso, every important building was now protected by popular volunteer forces like Mamadou's. The storm of popular awakening was washing away every lie. During this time, a secret video was leaked showing French, American, and Israeli officials at a round table discussing a new conspiracy against Traoré. In the video, a voice could be clearly heard: "If a blade is used and blame is placed on the opposition, the world will never be able to find the real killer." When this video was broadcast on Burkina Faso's national TV, the entire nation was stunned. But President Traoré said, "They think we'll be scared. But we've never learned to bow. The enemy who attacks from hiding will one day be wounded by his own dagger." After the Kaya base attack, if there was one face that amazed everyone, it was Mamadou's. When he appeared at a public press conference the day after the attack, standing beside President Traoré, all of Burkina Faso seemed to resonate with applause. But the story didn't end there. The young volunteers of the Mamadou National Movement had established a secret surveillance network throughout the country. No one suspected that some sleeping serpents still remained in the circles close to Traoré, those officials and dignitaries who were paid agents of the enemy. One day, inside the presidential palace, Mamadou himself was participating in a tea gathering when he noticed the unusual behavior of a captain in the guard unit. Mamadou's eyes weren't those of a trained soldier, but his heart was incredibly sharp in recognizing danger. The captain was secretly communicating with someone on his mobile phone in code words. Mamadou immediately informed the intelligence agency. Within the next hour, that captain was arrested. Investigation revealed that he was actually a French double agent whose purpose was to slowly poison Traoré after the Kaya base attack so that no one would suspect, and it could be called a natural death. This revelation created turmoil in security institutions. Lists were compiled of officers throughout the country who were involved in foreign funding. Dozens were suspended, some arrested, and some left the country voluntarily. On the other side, a high-ranking Mossad official in Israel who had prepared the plan for Traoré's assassination was caught through his own secret communications. Cyber experts from the Mamadou National Movement set up a fake communication setup and invited him to a fake diplomatic dinner where he was arrested within an African country. A video of his arrest was leaked in which he was confessing, "We decided to remove Traoré to suppress African awakening because he was standing against our regional interests. But we had no idea that a barber would expose us to the world." This video spread like fire on international media. CNN, Al Jazeera, RT, and even French TV5 began questioning imperialism for the first time. 2 months after the Kaya base attack, Burkina Faso's atmosphere had completely changed. Where there had previously been a reign of fear, silence, and helplessness, now there was light of enthusiasm, voice, and self-respect. The entire country seemed to have awakened with a new spirit. A historic rally was organized in the capital, where President Ibrahim Traoré, Mamadou, military leadership, intellectuals, farmers, youth, and representatives of all religions participated. The stage was simple, but the intensity of emotions made the atmosphere incomparable. When the rally began, all eyes were on President Traoré. He stood on a simple wooden platform in plain khaki uniform without any protocol. His voice carried the same firmness, truth, and pain that had been growing in this nation's wounds for years. He said, "Today I address you not as a president, but as a son, a brother, and a soldier. They came to kill us. We survived. They came to divide us. We united. They came to bend us. We stood up." Silence fell over the audience as if every word was being engraved on their hearts. The enemy used our own people against us. We learned that whether the gun belongs to the enemy or our own people, if the purpose is slavery, every shot is fired against us. But we also saw that a barber, a guard, a farmer, and a student can all become protectors of this nation. President Traoré took a paper from his pocket that was trembling in his hand. It was the letter sent by the French embassy requesting a softer attitude and restoration of trade with Burkina Faso. He raised that letter in the air and said, "This is the letter that once came in commanding tones. Today it has become a plea. This is our success." At this, the hall resonated with applause and slogans. At the rally's conclusion, President Traoré announced, "All French military bases are being completely closed. All international debts will be renegotiated, and the Mamadou national movement is being given constitutional status so that every citizen can participate in the country's protection and development." When the national anthem was played afterward, a new verse was included for the first time. "Where Mamadou walks, there the enemy stops." Finally, President Traoré set the microphone aside and said with tears in his eyes, "If I'm alive here today, it's due to my God's mercy, my mother's prayers, and my people's honor. My life is no longer just mine. It's a trust from all of you." Then he slowly stepped back, approached Mamadou, and placed his hand on his shoulder. Both looked at each other, two simple men, a simple country, and a great transformation. The sun was setting over Burkina Faso, but for the first time in years, it felt like a new dawn was breaking. The conspiracy that had been designed in the corridors of power in Washington, Paris, and Tel Aviv had not only failed, but had awakened a sleeping giant. Africa was no longer the same. The spirit of Mamadou, the barber who became a guardian, the common man who stood against empires, was spreading across the continent like wildfire. And President Ibrahim Traoré, wounded but unbroken, stood as a symbol of a new Africa that would never again bow to foreign masters. The Kaya conspiracy had failed, but it had given birth to something far more dangerous to the old order, the consciousness of a free people who had remembered their power. 6 months after the Kaya incident, delegations from across Africa visited Burkina Faso to learn from what was now being called the Mamadou model, grassroots security and governance led by the people themselves. President Traoré, his arm fully healed but carrying the scars of that day as badges of honor, stood in the same depot where blood had been spilled. It had been converted into a museum of African resistance. "They wanted to kill our body," he said to the gathered crowd, "but they gave birth to our soul." In the corner where Mamadou had first fallen protecting his president, a simple plaque read, "Here fell a barber, here rose a nation." The revolution was complete, but the story was just beginning. Across Africa, in villages and cities from Senegal to Somalia, people were asking the same question that had transformed Burkina Faso. If Mamadou could do it, why can't we? The answer was echoing across the continent like thunder, and the old empires were beginning to tremble. The ripple effects of the Kaya conspiracy's exposure spread far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Within weeks, similar movements began emerging across West Africa, each inspired by Mamadou's transformation from barber to national hero. In Mali, a young mechanic named Sekou organized his community against foreign mining companies that had been extracting gold for decades while leaving locals in poverty. If Mamadou could protect his president, Sekou declared at a village gathering, we can protect our resources. In Niger, university students led by Amina Hassan, a literature major, began documenting and exposing corruption networks linked to French uranium companies. They called themselves the Amina Guard, a direct homage to the Mamadou national movement. The phenomenon wasn't limited to former French colonies. In Ghana, Dr. Kwame Asante, an economics professor, started lecturing about the Burkina model, showing how a small Sahel nation had broken free from neo-colonial economic structures. His lectures, recorded and shared across social media, reached millions. Even in South Africa, where the political landscape was more complex, township communities began organizing what they called Mamadou circles, local groups focused on community self-defense and economic independence. The success of the Burkina Faso model sent alarm bells ringing through the intelligence communities of former colonial powers. In a classified briefing room beneath the Élysée Palace, French President Emmanuel Macron met with his Security Council. "We're looking at a potential domino effect," warned General Pierre Schill, head of French military intelligence. "If this ideology spreads to Ivory Coast or Senegal, we could lose our entire West African sphere of influence within 2 years." Similar concerns were being raised in Washington. Secretary of State Antony Blinken convened an emergency meeting of the Africa Bureau. "Traoré has become a symbol," he noted grimly. "Killing him now would only create a martyr. We need a different approach." The new strategy was multifaceted: economic warfare through trade restrictions, information warfare through social media manipulation, and political warfare through supporting opposition groups. But they had underestimated how deeply the Mamadou ethos had penetrated African society. The war moved to cyberspace. Thousands of fake social media accounts began spreading disinformation about President Traoré, claiming he was becoming a dictator, that Burkina Faso was sliding into chaos, that the economy was collapsing. But the Mamadou national movement had prepared for this. Tech-savvy young volunteers, many trained by returned diaspora, launched counter-operations. They created truth brigades, networks of fact-checkers who rapidly debunked false narratives. Aminata Traoré, a 24-year-old computer science graduate, who had returned from studying in Ghana, led the digital resistance. "They think they can fool us with the same old lies," she said during a live-streamed press conference. "But we have something they don't understand: the truth and people willing to fight for it." The Truth Brigade's most effective weapon was transparency. Every government meeting was live-streamed, every policy decision was explained in multiple languages, every financial transaction was made public. Corruption became nearly impossible when everything was visible. When the information war failed, the economic assault began. France imposed selective sanctions on Burkina Faso, restricting trade in key sectors. The World Bank suddenly found irregularities in ongoing projects and suspended funding. The IMF warned of economic instability and downgraded the country's credit rating. But President Traoré and his team had anticipated this response. They had spent months building alternative partnerships. China increased its investment in infrastructure projects. Russia expanded military cooperation and grain supplies. Iran offered favorable oil deals. Turkey provided technical assistance and equipment. More importantly, the African Union rallied around Burkina Faso. Ghana's President Nana Akufo-Addo publicly declared, "An attack on one African democracy is an attack on all." Nigeria's President Bola Tinubu announced increased trade agreements with Burkina Faso. The economic isolation backfired spectacularly. Instead of weakening Burkina Faso, it strengthened Pan-African economic ties and exposed the neo-colonial nature of Western economic relationships. Frustrated by their failures, hardliners in Western intelligence agencies authorized one final desperate attempt. On a humid evening in Ouagadougou, as President Traoré was returning from a community meeting in the suburbs, a sophisticated assassination attempt was made. The attack was carefully planned. A remotely detonated explosive device planted along the presidential route, timed to detonate as his motorcade passed. But the Mamadou National Movement's grassroots intelligence network had grown incredibly sophisticated. Fatima Ouedraogo, a market vendor who sold fruits near the targeted intersection, noticed unusual activity. Strange men asking questions about timing, vehicles parked in odd positions, new maintenance work that seemed suspicious. She reported her concerns to the local Mamadou circle. Within hours, the plot was uncovered. Bomb disposal experts found a device powerful enough to level a city block. The conspiracy trail led back through a network of local collaborators to handlers in neighboring countries, and ultimately to a coordination center in Abidjan, Ivory Coast, a facility with documented ties to French intelligence. The failed assassination attempt was the final straw. President Traoré called an emergency session of the African Union, presenting evidence of the plot. 23 African nations signed the Ouagadougou Declaration, condemning foreign interference and pledging mutual defense against external manipulation. The captured conspirators were put on trial in what media called the trial of the century. The proceedings were televised across Africa and live-streamed globally. For the first time, the mechanisms of neo-colonial control were laid bare in a court of law. Evidence presented included bank records showing payments from front companies. To local conspirators, communications intercepts, revealing coordination between foreign agencies and local assets. Testimony from former intelligence operatives who agreed to testify in exchange for immunity. Documentary evidence of systematic corruption. Networks spanning multiple countries. The most dramatic moment came when Colonel Amadou Sankara, no relation to the famous Thomas Sankara, testified. He had been approached by French handlers to participate in the coup, but had instead become a double agent, gathering evidence for months. They promised me a mansion in Paris and a Swiss bank account, he testified. All I had to do was betray my country and my president. But some things cannot be bought: honor, dignity, and love of motherland. The trials lasted 6 months and resulted in convictions ranging from treason to terrorism. But more importantly, they educated an entire continent about how foreign manipulation actually worked. Inspired by the transparency and success of Burkina Faso's resistance, African leaders called for a Continental Congress, the first gathering of its kind since the independence era. The meeting was held in Accra, Ghana, deliberately chosen for its symbolic significance as the birthplace of African unity movements. 43 African nations sent delegations. The agenda was simple but revolutionary. True independence: political, economic, and cultural. President Traoré's speech to the Congress became legendary. Brothers and sisters, we have proven that the emperor has no clothes. These powers that ruled us for centuries, that made us believe we were weak and dependent, they are paper tigers. When we stand together, when we remember our dignity, when we choose truth over convenience, they cannot touch us. Mamadou was not special because he was superhuman. Mamadou was special because he was completely human. He chose courage over fear, truth over lies, sacrifice over selfishness. In every village across Africa, there are thousands of Mamadous waiting to awaken. The Congress resulted in several groundbreaking agreements: the African Communications Network, an independent internet infrastructure free from Western monitoring; the African Monetary Cooperation Pact, reducing dependence on Western currencies; the Continental Security Cooperation Treaty, mutual defense against foreign interference; the African Youth Corps, exchange programs to develop Pan-African leadership. 2 years after the Kaya conspiracy, a new generation of African leaders was emerging. They were young, educated, technologically savvy, and completely unintimidated by former colonial powers. In Senegal, 29-year-old Ousmane Sonko rose to prominence advocating for complete economic independence from France. His rallies drew hundreds of thousands, with crowds chanting, "We are all Mamadou." In Kenya, Dr. Wanjiku Kihoro, a Harvard-educated economist, published a best-selling book titled The Mamadou Principle: How One Barber Changed Africa's Destiny. The book became required reading in universities across the continent. In Nigeria, tech entrepreneur Kemi Adeleke created the Mamadou app, a platform for organizing community resistance and sharing information about corporate and political corruption. Within months, it had over 10 million users across Africa. These leaders shared common characteristics. They were incorruptible, fearless, and absolutely committed to African dignity and independence. The African awakening had global implications. In Latin America, indigenous movements began studying the Burkina model. In Asia, small nations facing pressure from larger powers found inspiration in Traoré's resistance. Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro invited President Traoré to Caracas, where they signed cooperation agreements and shared strategies for resisting economic warfare. "You have shown the world," Maduro declared, "that dignity is stronger than dollars." In Iran, Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei praised the Burkina Faso resistance as proof that the oppressed nations can defeat the sea. Oppressors when they rely on their people and their principles. Even in Europe and North America, progressive movements found inspiration. Yellow vest protesters in France began carrying signs reading, "Nous sommes tous Mamadou." We are all Mamadou. The success of the African resistance movement created an existential crisis for the Western political establishment. In a secret meeting at Camp David, attended by the leaders of the G7 nations, a final strategy was devised. "We cannot allow the African continent to completely slip from our sphere of influence," declared the British Prime Minister. "The economic implications alone would reshape global power dynamics." The plan was ambitious and desperate. A coordinated economic blockade, combined with support for proxy conflicts in key regions, designed to create chaos and force African nations back into dependence. But they had fatally underestimated how much had changed. The Africa of 2024 was not the Africa of 1960. Information flowed freely, economies were diversifying, military capabilities were improving, and most importantly, the people were awake. When the blockade began, African nations responded with unprecedented unity. South Africa opened its ports to landlocked nations. Nigeria shared its oil reserves. Egypt provided transit routes. Morocco and Algeria set aside their historical differences to coordinate responses. The blockade lasted 3 months and failed completely. Instead of breaking African resistance, it accelerated African integration and forced the continent to develop independent capabilities even faster. On the 3rd anniversary of the Kaya conspiracy, President Traoré stood once again in the converted museum that had once been a weapons depot. But this time, he was not alone. With him stood presidents and prime ministers from across Africa, representing what had become known as the Mamadou generation of African leadership. 3 years ago, in this very room, they thought they could kill an idea by killing a man, President Traoré reflected. They discovered that ideas are bulletproof and that the spirit of a free people cannot be murdered. Mamadou, now bearing the official title of Guardian of Continental Unity, stepped forward. His transformation from barber to continental leader exemplified the broader African transformation. "When I first picked up that gun to protect my president," Mamadou said, "I was not thinking about history or politics or economics. I was thinking about dignity. The dignity of not kneeling when you should stand, of not being silent when you should speak, of not surrendering when you should fight. That dignity was not just mine. It belongs to every African, every person, who refuses to accept that some human beings are born to serve others. The question is not whether we can be free. The question is whether we will choose to be free." 5 years after the Kaya conspiracy, the African continent had been transformed beyond recognition. GDP growth rates averaged 8% annually. Literacy rates soared as education became a continental priority. Diseases that had plagued the continent for centuries were being eliminated through coordinated public health programs. Perhaps most importantly, a generation of young Africans was growing up with unshakable confidence in their abilities and their future. They were multilingual, technologically sophisticated, and completely uninterested in accepting subordinate status to anyone. Former colonial powers were forced to engage with Africa as equals, negotiating trade deals and cooperation agreements on terms that respected African sovereignty and interests. President Traoré, now serving his second term, had become a global icon of successful resistance to neocolonialism. His autobiography, From Barber's Shop to Continental Unity, was translated into dozens of languages and studied in universities worldwide. But perhaps the most profound change was psychological. Across Africa, people walked differently, talked differently, dreamed differently. The psychological chains of colonialism, the internalized belief in inferiority that had persisted for generations, had been finally broken. In schools across the continent, children learned about Mamadou, not as a hero to be worshipped, but as proof of what ordinary people could accomplish when they chose courage over fear. Mamadou was not special because he was superhuman, teachers would explain. Mamadou was special because he was completely human, and chose to act on his humanity when it mattered most. The conspiracy that had been designed to destroy African independence had instead catalyzed the greatest period of African unity, prosperity, and dignity since the pharaohs ruled the Nile. In the end, the greatest victory was not political or economic. It was spiritual. Africa had remembered who it was, and the world would never be the same. The end.